Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boxing fans around the world. I'm back with another update for this weekend, and I'm doing it slightly early, as I suspect, of course, it's Friday, but I suspect with Christmas, many of you may be tuned out, and there's not really much happening from a schedule perspective, so I figured I would go ahead and just get it out of the way. There's only one fight that I'm going to be talking about this weekend, but I'm also going to be doing updates about fights that I think are worth your attention in the new year. January is a stacked month for boxing, as is February. A lot of things are happening, and I'm going to go through that methodically. So I'm going to cover basically the next essentially month and a half ish worth of fights that I think are worth your time. But if you are in a country that happens to celebrate Christmas, then, I want to make sure that I wish you a merry little Christmas and that you are able to spend time with your family or whatever it is you do, because I think it's important. So let's get right into this. Now, I'm going to start first with some recent events that have happened and some recent updates and things that took place before with a number of fighters that were recently either fighting or recent news, whatever it is, because I want to get these out of the way. Some of these you may already be aware of, but I want to make sure I'm as complete as I can be with what's going on here. So at the top of the hour, let's talk about Mr. Terrence Bud Crawford. And of course, the latest update with Crawford is he was able to take care of Showtime Sean Porter in December and then moved himself to be a free agent. Well, he said during a post fight that he wanted to move forward his career and he wanted to continue his dream of unifying 147. As far as right now, as we can know, he has not chosen to sign with the PBC, which many have said would have been a requirement for him to get the biggest fights that are out there that are remaining. And I talked about the 147 division and the fact that the old guard is kind of on the way out and you kind of have the newer stars coming in and there's kind of a shift happening. This continues. There's been a lot of shifts. I covered on a previous update about the fact that now Errol Spence and Yordenis Ugas have been cleared to fight. That one's being put in the books by the WBA and all the sanctioning orgs for the unification, the IBF and WBC. All three have to come together to make that happen. That would be a PBC broadcast because both Spence and Ugas are PBC. So that would likely be TGB Promotions that's running that guy. And once that's finalized, I know Spence has said he wanted to try to fight in March if he could. So once that does get finalized, then that would more than likely be a pay-per-view. I'd be shocked if it wasn't a pay-per-view. And I'm assuming they'd probably put it on Showtime pay-per-view just because it's a PBC broadcast and it's a TGB Promotions that's backing it. I could have it wrong. Keep an eye on that one because that one, if that one goes forward, and I don't see a reason why I wouldn't unless Spence gets injured again, that one's going to be an exciting fight. People are kind of trashing that fight because of Ugas. And here's the thing. Yordenis Ugas is a very talented fighter. He's a very technical fighter. He's a very skilled fighter. And he's underrated because, number one, he doesn't speak English himself. But more importantly, he's not the boisterous type. He's a very quiet guy. He'll call out, but he doesn't put himself out there in a way similar to Crawford, right? And that's why I said that Crawford and Ugas wouldn't draw any money, just like, Ugas and Pacquiao didn't draw any money because Ugas doesn't draw either. But that's why I felt like Crawford should have gone straight after Ugas to get him out of the way and get two belts to build towards Crawford and Spence unification. Crawford didn't do that. I felt that Crawford should have gone up to 154 and taken the belt from Patrick Cesar when Cesar had the belt. Crawford didn't do that either. So now what we're stuck with is that 154 is in a shuffle. You now have Spence and Ugas, which we believe will lead to Spence now having three belts, possible lineal and ring included, depending on what happens with the ring and if they decide to sanction the ring title for Spence Ugas once it's signed. Because if they do, as I've said, and I know NSB doesn't agree, but the truth is anybody who holds the ring is assumed to be lineal champion in the eyes of the media and the predominant boxing world outside the bubble. So if that happens, we could see that you would have basically the lineal champion, the top dog, as being Errol Spence. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not for any reason saying that Spence is guaranteed to beat Ugas because Ugas is a very tricky fighter to fight, and it's a compelling fight to watch if it does happen. Ugas does have the ability to potentially upset Errol Spence. The thing that I think is the differentiator, honestly, is the fact that Spence is not afraid to take a hit to walk forward. He comes forward at you, and he's not afraid to take damage, as we saw with Sean Porter. But remember, Sean Porter almost beat Errol Spence. It was a very close fight. If Porter hadn't been dropped that might have gone Porter's way. Now, I didn't agree with the judges on Crawford versus Porter because I felt like they were gifting Crawford rounds. I had Porter easily winning going into the 10th. Crawford was fighting from behind, and he was winning rounds from round 7, 7, 8, 9, and of course round 10. And then I gave him round 2. So he was winning rounds, but I had Porter up. And the judges apparently at the time of the stoppage had Crawford up by like 2 or 3 rounds, which I completely disagree with, emphatically disagree with. And it seemed like they were gifting Crawford rounds because Porter was not fully effective, but he was landing and he was effective. I would argue his performance against Crawford was better than it was against Errol Spence because in Spence, Porter was being nullified once Spence adjusted to the aggression. Porter was being nullified, and then him getting caught with the shot. That was happening all fight. He was getting hit. It's just that one got him at the right time, that perfect time. People go back and say, well, Crawford stopped him. Crawford didn't stop him. Kenny Porter stopped him. So let's get that straight. Then they say, well, he would have been da-da-da. We don't know what would happen because Kenny stopped it. So we can if and whatever. But at the end of the day, I felt that Porter was much more dominant against Crawford until round 10. And we don't know what might have happened had the fight been allowed to go the distance. Porter might have been able to drop Crawford, which would have helped balance the odds and might have helped get it to where at least it was a draw. If Porter had then retired, it would have been what it was, but we've changed history. And so now fast forward, and you got Porter, who arguably lost against Yordenis Ugas, depending on how you looked at it. You might have had him losing against Ugas. The point is he got his hand raised. And then he has a stellar performance against Errol Spence. And now Errol Spence, who we saw, it took aggression to get that kind of performance and to get that kind of score against Errol Spence. Ugas is not going to be that aggressive. So that's kind of the flex factor is if we know that Ugas doesn't fight like that and he boxes smart and he's a tactician in the ring, that's something that Errol Spence has not frequently fought with the exception of Kell Brook and Chris Algieri. But Chris Algieri fought Spence more aggressive than we would have thought. He was tactical, but he was aggressive more than Ugas would have been. Kell Brook, same thing. He was a heavily tactical fighter, very similar to what we would see, I would think, from Yordenis Ugas. Ugas isn't going to clinch you, though. So it's a compelling fight, and I don't want you to think that I'm predicting that Spence just dominates the dude, because I don't see that. I see that decision-wise, it has an opportunity to go the distance, or we might see Spence finish him, which would be the first for Yordenis Ugas if that happens, but it could very well go the distance, and if it does, I see that Spence would beat him in a very close decision if it does go to the bell. I don't see Ugas being able to stop Spence unless Spence comes in damage, which I don't see that happening either. Spence is still young. He has some physical challenges from the accident and everything, but I don't see that Ugas is going to dominate is what I'm kind of getting at. So then that would leave Errol Spence basically as the true A-side, full A-side, 100%. 3 belts to Crawford's 1. Crawford would have no leverage, and others outside of NSB have said Crawford really has no leverage because he only has 1 belt and hasn't gone against another belt, and he has not worked to take out the rest of the division that were still at their peak, that were still kind of dangerous, as Spence has done. This was the first time against Sean Porter. So some have said, hey, Crawford, you need to step up with some of these guys and build some more of that reputation. Ugas is kind of out of the way. I wish he had gone after Ugas because I think that would have been winnable for Crawford. I know Ugas beat Crawford in the AMs, but at this stage, I think coming off the Manny win, Ugas's head might have been big, where Crawford could have clipped him and stopped him, and that would have sent a huge message. It would have given him 2 belts, and now it's 2 belts on 2 belts, and we would have had a new lineal champion. Crawford chose not to do that. He chose to instead fight somebody else. So that's out of the way. You got Keith Thurman. Keith Thurman's coming back to fight Mario Barrios, and it is confirmed. It is the same Mario Barrios who was stopped by Tank Davis, a lightweight. So a lightweight is moving up in weight to fight a welterweight. And I talked about that one where I'm leaning Barrios just because Keith's mind doesn't seem to be still in the game. And I'm hoping he's able to disprove that. But his performance against Mario Barrios will tell us whether or not he's still in the game or not. But he should not struggle with a lightweight. I say that because if you remember, Chris Algieri was essentially a lightweight when he fought Manny Pacquiao. Floyd talked about, he went the distance with a lightweight. And so if Keith goes the distance with Mario Barrios, it's not a good look. So I don't think Crawford's going to ever fight Keith Thurman. It might happen, but if it is, it'll be when Keith's on the way out the door. Just another washed name. Then there's Virgil Ortiz. And Virgil Ortiz, the weird thing with Ortiz is that apparently he's making moves to try to get a position for a shot at Crawford's WBO welterweight. So he is trying to get some fights that would position him to make him essentially the mandatory for WBO. And I find that interesting because at one point, Virgil Ortiz was given the WBA gold title, which should have guaranteed him a title shot, a future title shot against the WBA champion, which would have been Ugas. For whatever reason, he has never cashed that in, and it doesn't show that he still holds it. And there was never a news update about what happened to it. So it may be that he either relinquished it and just said, screw it, I'm not doing WBA, or he just is so confident he can beat Crawford, because he's called out Crawford on a couple of occasions, that he just said, let's go this way. Let's make this happen for the fans. I want to get in the mix. And then, of course, there's Jerron Boots Ennis, and he's out there. He's that latest eye test fighter. If you've heard the name, he's an eye test guy. He hasn't fought anybody of any note, but because he looks flashy, places like NSB are praising him as the next coming, and he beats everybody in the world. And even Spence has said that, Boots Ennis would beat Porter, and he believes Boots Ennis would beat Crawford, and Crawford thinks Boots Ennis beats Spence. It's the same thing. They're hyping up the guys, but of course, neither Spence or Crawford would fight Boots Ennis because Boots Ennis hasn't fought anybody else. So it's kind of this quandary where, Porter talked about it before fighting Crawford. He wanted to have Crawford fight somebody else to kind of get a name, some big name that's still in the prime before he went in, but ultimately nobody was stepping in. So he said, I'll just go ahead and do it. Why not? Because I think I can beat him, and I want the belt anyway. And he didn't get it done. So now Boots Ennis is in the same position where he's not able to get those title shots because he doesn't have any leverage. He doesn't have any way to convince promoters that it's worth having the fight. The reason I gave you this whole full spectrum about what's going on at 147 is you've got some new up-and-comers coming in there. I haven't even talked about Blair the Flair Cobbs. He's still out there. Rashad Mahdi might come into the division. You got a lot of guys that are hungry, and they saw the limelight of the 147 when it was in its heyday, and they want to have a piece of that action. They see guys like Spence on the way out. They see Crawford's getting older. All these things are happening, and they want a piece. But it all kind of centers around two guys, Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence. Errol Spence is the A side of the division. This is not refuted. I don't care what NSB says. It's not refuted. He is the A side of the division. He calls the shots. He's going to fight who he fights. He has refused to fight Keith Thurman because Keith Thurman ducked him when he was on the way up, and he has every right to do that. He can be criticized. It doesn't really matter. And you got Crawford out there, and Crawford is really coming from behind. Now, Crawford is in a trouble position because as a free agent, yes, he's got some freedom to make moves, but he lacks the leverage, which means he still needs to partner with a promoter who is going to get him the fights that builds to the bigger fights. And rumor has it from various outlets that now that he's away from Bob Arum, other outlets are not interested in signing with Crawford. They don't want to have him on the books because I believe Bob Arum's previous comments about Crawford, talking about, how much money he's lost on Crawford and he could build a house in Beverly Hills, the money he's lost, nice house, that kind of stuff, I think has hurt Crawford's, marketability in the eyes of other ones. And I believe that was intentional by Bob Arum. I believe what he was doing was throwing salt in the wound to try to hurt the guy's position. And it's sad because I think Crawford should have just signed with the PBC, dealt with their rules to get into the big fights, because we've seen proof now. PBC makes the fights happen between those guys as long as you have your A side is, open to doing, you haven't done anything to turn the A side off, right? So Spence and Crawford, I think, would have been the next, arguably, if Crawford had just said, you know what, I'm in PBC, but here's my condition. I want Spence next. I think they would have done it. I think Spence would have been okay with it. And I think the money would have worked out because PBC does a good job of promoting lesser fighters and getting the big money in there. We just saw it with Tank versus Isaac Cruz. So Crawford's in a hard spot. He's in a very difficult spot because, if you leave and you're independent, that's good because nothing stops you. But the problem is you have to have some leverage. When Floyd left Top Rank, he had leverage. He had leverage by way of the wins he had, the titles he had, the kinds of, the way he self-promoted, put himself out there. Crawford doesn't self-promote. He doesn't put himself out there. He's tried. It's just not good for him. So it'll remain to be seen how he's going to be able to sell himself to get that big fight, or maybe Crawford just simply vacates and goes to 154. He's got a couple of options, but he doesn't have anything that's going to be a big deal. Ultimately, all I'm going to say, to me, from my eyes, Errol Spence is the A side of the division, period, point blank. Errol Spence is the one who should call the shots. At minimum, it's a 60-40 in favor of Errol Spence. Anything else is unreasonable. Crawford needs to know that. And if he's not going to do that, then you might as well move up and go to another division and make some waves there. Because I do think he would make waves at 154, especially now, because it looks like Ruslan Lara might have moved up because I haven't seen him. So with him out of the way, I mean, I would love to see Crawford in the ring against a Jermell Charlo. Could you imagine that one? He's aligned with Spence. So Crawford goes to 154, sparks out Jermell Charlo. Spence now has some appetite to go and fight the dude. I would love to see Crawford force the issue by going to another division and do what you got to do. But that's me. In other news, Canelo Alvarez, the number one pound for pound. I don't care what NSB says. He is the number one pound for pound by resume and record. He has done it all. He unified 168. And now he's going after apparently a cruiserweight champion. It doesn't matter the level. The point is the guy's a champion. It's not his fault about who he fought. And he gets a lot of flack, right? Because of who happens to hold belts. That's not his fault. They hold belts. And if you're a boxer, your job is to ultimately get titles, because the titles are how you get notoriety and the value that's necessary to then become like Floyd, where it didn't matter if he had a belt or not, he was still going to close multiple millions of dollars at the gate. Canelo's already at the point he doesn't need the titles, but he wants to make history, said it on multiple occasions. That means he has to go after the title holders, and he's done that. He's gone after champions at 168. You're Rocky Fielding, who nobody regarded, but the point is Rocky beat somebody legit to get the title. You're Callum Smith, nobody regarded him, but then Callum Smith, when he beat a legitimate George Groves, people made excuses. Hey, Groves was injured because of what happened in the Eubank fight. Point is, Groves was still a top fighter, regarded a top fighter. Callum Smith was considered the lineal champion. Blame the orgs if you have a problem with it, but Canelo beat the lineal champion, making him the guy. Then you have Billy Ho or Billy Juice, depending on what forum you're on, Saunders, who kind of sat on his laurels and didn't really test himself outside of Chris Eubank. And ultimately, it's a blowout, and Saunders gets his face smashed in because he had never been stepped up, never been tested. Okay, but he was still a champion. He was champion for a long time. And then, of course, there's Caleb Plant, who was an eye test fighter, and then that was a good performance from Plant, but ultimately he fell to the master. So Canelo Alvarez is the top guy, pound for pound. He's the face of the sport, period, and very few fighters beat him. Now the current squawking is, well, why don't you fight? First it was, why don't you fight Beterbiev? And then Beterbiev has a good but still beatable performance very recently against Marcus Brown. And so now people are saying, okay, Canelo fight him now because he looks beatable. He always looks beatable. Let's be honest with ourselves. The difference is the headbutt. The headbutt made you see some vulnerability you hadn't seen before. But Beterbiev has always seemed vulnerable depending on the fighter that's in there with. The difference is that Beterbiev has largely fought guys that come after him. He infrequently fights guys who box smart. Canelo's a boxer. He's not going to come after you. That means he'd box circles around Beterbiev, and if he did get caught, as we saw against Golovkin twice, Canelo is able to take the shots. He just chooses not to. He's preserving himself. Okay, then, like the waves, everybody then shifted over to David Benavidez, who's another eye test fighter. And why won't Canelo fight Benavidez? Why are you jumping over that? Why are you fighting a weak champion? Again, if I'm Canelo, I ignore the noise, do what you're doing, continue to make history, and don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, you're the one in the ring taking the punches, not them. So I'm not going to criticize him for who he beat, because let's be honest here, Crawford has one signature win at 147, and people call him number one pound for pound. But yet, Canelo has a significant number of signature wins over his very brief career. He's still in his prime, and he doesn't get any credit. So if I'm him, I've ignored the noise. I don't see anything significant with Benavidez. I really don't, especially because Canelo is taking out champions where Benavidez is not. And then on the other side, there was a recent update came from Mauricio Sulaiman, and he's on the WBC side. And he gave an announcement that said that he thinks that the various organizations should recognize George CM Punk Kambosos as the true undisputed champion. Now, the reason that this is important is if you know the current layout at lightweight, Devin Haney has held the WBC regular lightweight title, and people call it the so-called, quote, email title. As it was given to him, it was not something he won in the ring. Kambosos won the franchise title, and he won it because Teofimo beat Lomachenko, who was the franchise champion. Here's the problem. In the earlier interviews with Canelo, around Canelo, Sulaiman said the franchise title is not to be defended. It's not something you win. It's just something you're granted. The fact that Teo was able to take the franchise title from Lomachenko broke the rule. And then Suleiman said, it's not a big deal. We just decided it made sense. They're just shifting and running around so they can get the sanctioning fees. We know the game. So Teofimo became franchise champion. He was never truly undisputed because Devin Haney still had the regular title. When Kambosos came along as the mandatory for IBF, and he said, I'm going to beat this dude. There's no way he's going to beat me. Life's falling apart. He's partying. He's having fun. Nobody believed this dude. He goes in there, has a stellar performance, takes the titles, including the franchise title. He's not, the NSB and others say he's not undisputed because he's got to beat Haney. They did say the same thing about Teofimo. With Teofimo, they called Teo undisputed. Regardless, now with this Suleiman announcement, he's basically affirming, you know what? The title that Devin has is really the so-called symbolic belt. It's not one, that's the one that wouldn't be defended. We need to give Kambosos his credit because he beat the man who beat the man, is what Suleiman's essentially saying. So as far as we're concerned, and as far as the WBC has recognized, George CM Punk Kambosos is the undisputed champion at lightweight, regardless of not beating Devin Haney for that title. And if he's able to convince, as in Suleiman, able to convince the IBF, the WBO, and WBA to recognize Kambosos as the true unified champion, which I believe they would because they already have said so, then ultimately it puts a wash to Devin Haney ever getting that fight, is what it does. And Devin Haney's getting a screw job because it means that he got a title, he defended it on a couple of occasions, but it doesn't mean anything. And so he's fought for nothing other than the notoriety. And Devin Haney's in a lesser position, he always has been, to guys like Tank Davis. So it's a very unfortunate situation for Devin Haney, and I'm not sure how he would respond to it because there's not really much he can do because he's only WBC. And there's another update I'll give here in a moment that I think would have averted that problem, but he didn't choose to do that either. So it is what it is, but that's what's out for the WBC. At lightweight, George CM Punk Kambosos is likely to be considered your unified lightweight champion going forward, and then that sets up the fight, preferably, I'd say, against Lomachenko, because Lomachenko has had now 2 victories and was well deserving of a rematch. I don't see that Teo deserves a rematch, and he has indicated he doesn't want it. In other news, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. is back in action, and if you don't know who I'm talking about, he's the guy that most known for losing to Lomachenko, and that's his only loss to date, even though it was years ago. It's his only loss, and he has pivoted to only fighting once a year. He's done interviews where he has said that, he chooses when he will fight, and he chooses to preserve and kind of work through his career as he does. And he is a champion at featherweight, and he's a decent. Now, make sure you don't confuse him because there's like 3 different Russells. When I say Mr. Gary Russell Jr., there's Gary Russell Jr., and then there's Gary Antoine Russell. Don't confuse the two. Gary Russell Jr., that's why I call him Mr. Gary Russell Jr., because that distinguishes for me that it's different than the Gary Antoine Russell. It's a different fighter. Mr. Gary Russell Jr., he's fighting Mark Masayo. This is happening in January for the featherweight title. The reason this is getting news is just because Gary Russell has been out for so long. I don't think he fought in the span of 2021. So that means he's got to catch up if he's doing a once a year to fight twice in 2022, starting with this one. Let's see if that plays out. But I'm leaning towards Masayo, and let me tell you why. Masayo is a solid fighter. He's a decent, I'm not going to say he's like one of these top tiers, but he's a solid fighter, and he has a very strong probability of upsetting Russell because of his style, but also he was able to take out Julio Ceja, and Julio Ceja, or Ceja, depending on how you pronounce it. He had a great win on Ceja. Ceja was a top-level fighter at the time he fought this guy, and I think he has a really good shot at upsetting Russell. Keep an eye out on this one. I don't know if Russell is on the decline. He doesn't seem to be. Seems to be still performing really good, just like Rigan Diao. It's like they seem to be at the top performance-wise, but there's got to be a point where your inactivity starts to work against you. This could be that fight. This could be Russell's version of the Isaac Cruz fight for Tank Davis, where it's just like you get the win, but it's clear that this guy over here was hungry and was going after it, and then there's this chatter about potentially getting robbed. So that one's definitely worth a look. But I wanted to call it out. The other one I want to call out is Julio Cesar Chavez. So Julio Cesar Chavez, most known, of course, for his fight. He fought Canelo Alvarez. He fought Sergio Maravilla Martinez. So he's had notable fights, but he's banking off his name at this point. He's kind of had some major issues, and I don't know why. He lost to Anderson Silva, who had never been a boxer, which was a shocker, and then he lost against another dude. I don't even remember who the heck that was. But he still wants to keep fighting, and I'm not sure why he keeps going because he doesn't seem to be able to step up. It's like he gets one win, and then he thinks he's back, and then he just drops it all. So Jake Paul has reached out to Chavez. He reached out, says, hey, let's do this. I want to fight this guy because Jake Paul, of course, got a brutal knockout of Tyron Woodley, who's a UFC fighter. And, Chavez, of course, is on the decline. He's been on the decline for years. His mind's not in it. It's obvious he's banking off the name. So now Jake Paul says, hey, let's get Chavez Jr. in there. You know what's sad? I think Jake Paul knocks out Chavez Jr. And I wouldn't normally say that, but Chavez is not mentally there. He's not mentally there. It's not skill. Is your mind in the right place? Chavez Jr.'s mind's not there. His own dad said his mind's not there. So if that fight happens, I'm leaning way towards Jake Paul. I don't think the fight happens because I think Chavez would ask for too much money. That's my theory. Now, what he said was, look, let's get a few million for a fight. This is Chavez. He said, let's get a few million. I disagree. I don't think he'll take a few million. But let's say he says that, okay, I'll take a few million. And if he beats me, then I won't get anything, right? We don't know how serious he is, or is he just talking outside of his face. If that fight gets signed, it's worth watching, if only to see Chavez get knocked out of the business because he's been such a disappointment. I seriously want to see that one go forward. I don't think it will, but let's see if it does. So Chavez Jr. is back, y'all, and we'll see where it goes. And then the last, I don't want to say update, but last two pieces. So Ruslan Pravadnikov, but best known for his war with Chris Algerian's war against Tim Bradley. And then, of course, he had a war with Lucas Matisse, and then he got outboxed by John Molina, and that was his retirement. He was talking about making a comeback. He did make a comeback in a charity event, and he beat the guy, and he barely got out of that one. And then he said, no, I'm done. So he may do charity things here and there, but he doesn't have the fire anymore, essentially. He just doesn't want to do it anymore. And ultimately, when you get outboxed by John Molina, you probably should have hung it up. So, but he did, he did have a lot of wars. I mean, the guy was just getting battered against Lucas Matisse in particular. So sometimes guys just get beat down, and it happens. So Ruslan Pravadnikov, any rumors you heard about his comeback they're not wrong. They're just not going to happen. He's done. And then Tommy Fury, who of course ducked out of the fight with Jake Paul at the last minute after he saw the knockout of Tyron Woodley, came out and said, well, if that was me in there, I'd have beat him. Of course, we know that he ducked it, and he didn't want to smoke, and he knows in his head he doesn't really want to. He doesn't want to get that knockout. He would have got sparked. Tommy Fury would have got. Tyron Woodley lasted 6 rounds against this dude, and he's a freaking MMA fighter. Tommy Fury, if you ever watch his fights, Tommy Fury would have probably got taken out by that shot in round 2. I'm serious. Jake Paul, Jake Paul's legitimate, but it's not even that. It's that Tommy Fury is just so bad. Like, I stylistically can't see that he would survive as well as Tyron did. Tyron did decent enough to avoid getting clipped until the round 6, and they just made a mistake. It could happen. But Tommy Fury, it's like he gets clipped every fight he's in there. He's getting bombed, and then he happens to pull out the win. I think Jake Paul puts him to sleep in 2 rounds, but of course he ducked out of the opportunity to have the fight that would have been his biggest payday, biggest exposure. He would have got slept. He might have got hurt. He might have ended up as a Gerald McClellan situation if he had gotten hit by that shot, because I don't think Tommy's ever taken that much damage off of a shot. But he's just talking smoke because he can, because he's like, it's like the, hey, yeah, glad you're lucky he's holding me back. It's that kind of thing. So that's what we got there. Let's go down the schedule now. So here's what's coming. Tomorrow, Vito Mielnicki versus Nick DeLomba. This is happening in New Jersey. This is on Fox Sports. It's at the welterweight weight class, and I've not followed either one of these guys. I don't know if the fight is worth your time or money. However, there's a guy on the undercard that I think is potentially worth your time. And this is not pay-per-view. It looks like it's PBC on Fox, which is a regular broadcast. Joey Spencer has kind of raised eyes. He's got people to look at him and say, hey, I'm here. Vito Mielnicki he's kind of an up-and-comer, but he's not been promoted heavily. He's not been excessively exposed. Treat this as watching kind of up-and-coming fighters, this whole event. treat it as you're just seeing guys that are they're on their way up and they're trying to get a name and they're trying to get exposed and they're worth your time. And so if you like seeing who's coming new next, that's what this would be worth watching for. It's not for known outcomes. I should not expect known outcomes in here. I will say that Mielnicki is a solid fighter that has mentally slipped. He's had some challenges because of the way that he has sparred has caused him some problems. His most recent outing, he took a loss that people thought he should not have taken a loss, but he took a loss against a guy that was, I would argue, B level at best. And he's kind of on the comeback. And so he's fresh off a loss here. But the thing is that they were planning to have the rematch, and then something happened with the rematch, didn't go forward. And so now we're here with this new challenger in Nick DeLomba, who I've never heard of. So treat this, if you do watch on PBC on Fox in New Jersey on tomorrow for Christmas, treat this as here's the new class, right? The new up-and-coming fighters of the division, the welterweight division, and some in heavyweight and so on. Treat it as that. Don't treat it as anything other than that. So don't expect to see very many people in the crowds or any super showmanship. It's just, let's see who's coming, who's new, who's possibly exciting. And this is their chance to get exposed. And of course, there's no excess cost for it because it's on PBC on Fox. That's all we have as far as this weekend. Now, next week, there were supposed to be some fights. They're not going to happen, and they've been rescheduled. So that means we're going to be in like January, possibly February for some of these. One of them was the return of Gennady Golovkin. He was supposed to fight Ryota Murata. That was supposed to happen this Wednesday. So as far as I can tell on DAZN, as far as I can tell, that is not going to happen because there are some travel challenges probably from Murata. I don't know when the new date's going to come out, but he's supposed to return as Golovkin sometime in the near future. And then it's going to be for a middleweight gold. Of course, that's 160 pounds. And this could be one of the last fights for Golovkin because, of course, he's getting older, right? So, and his performances seem to increasingly have declined. He's nowhere near as explosive as he once was. He's going the distance these days. And Murata's a pretty solid fighter. So when that fight happens, it'll be exciting to see. But ultimately, I think Golovkin's on his way out the door. Jerwin Cajas versus Kazuto Ioka. That was supposed to happen as well. It was on Super Flyweight. It never got scheduled. That one's also had some travel challenges, and that's probably on the Ioka's side, I'm assuming. That one's not going to happen. That was supposed to happen next Friday. That's not going to happen. So now we're in January, and January is stacked. We've got a lot. Showtime's doing the bulk of it, but we got a lot. Luis Ortiz versus Charles Martin, Prince Charles Martin. That one's happening on New Year's Day, and that's Fox Sports. That one's happening at the Hard Rock in Florida. And, of course, heavyweight. And if you know about heavyweight division or you follow the heavyweight division, you know that Luis Ortiz was most known for fighting Deontay Wilder twice. And, of course, he took 2 losses. But the point is that he had a stellar showing both times. Prince Charles Martin, I would argue he's best known for essentially quitting against Anthony Joshua. He's one of those fighters that I think once he got into the bright lights, he just got deer in the headlights and he can't show up and perform. This fight is a good style matchup because Luis Ortiz is a very good, solid counterpuncher, very good defensive fighter. Charles Martin, he's more aggressive than counter, but he has his moments. And so it's hard to call this particular fight to know if Luis Ortiz is, they always joke that he's like older than his age, which could be, but he hasn't taken a lot of damage in his career. The most damage he took is against Wilder. Charles Martin hasn't taken any damage at all, hardly at all in his career, and he's hardly been tested. He was tested, but not as much as you would expect, like Ortiz was. So as far as that one goes, I'm going to lean towards Ortiz stylistically. I find Ortiz to be the more robust, durable fighter, and I don't think Martin's going to have enough to take Ortiz out. However, if Martin can pull it out, I think he will jump up in the rankings just because Martin has not shown up before. So to be so much better than what he was, he'll instantly jump up in the rankings is my gut. At lightweight, we got Luis Nunez versus Carlos Arrieta, and that's on Showtime. That's at the Carb Royale in Florida. This one, because it's lightweight, it's one of those up-and-comer type fights, but I don't know if that fight is another one of those, hey, here's who's coming to the division type showings, right? Because it's on Showtime, that we see just guys that you aren't necessarily aware of. Maybe they fought on lesser undercards like before. Like some of these have been on Showbox and other ones. There's a lot of undefeated fighters on this card. So if you do like seeing undefeated, O's getting taken, you're probably going to see a lot of knockouts in this one. So if you are the kind of fight fan who just likes the action type fights, this one's probably one to take a look at. I will say about Luis Nunez, he's a very young, he reminds me of not by fighting, but by his style, general style. He reminds me a lot of Tito Trinidad. Fighting style, he's way different, but just his style, he reminds me of Tito Trinidad. So I think he is going to be a standout in the future when we start seeing more of these guys get injected into title shots. I think Luis Nunez is one to keep an eye out on. Let's see, mid-January, we've got light heavyweight action with Joe Smith versus Callum Johnson. That's on ESPN. That's a Turning Stone in New York. And I don't watch the light heavyweight division hardly at all. But of course, remember, as I said, Canelo Alvarez is making his inroads into cruiserweight and then possibly back into light heavyweight. Remember, he fought Cove at light heavyweight. So these guys might be in a position to fight Canelo Alvarez at some future point. Now, with Joe Smith, the one thing I'm going to call out about this fight, Smith versus Johnson, Joe Smith caught COVID. This is back in October, I believe it was. And he was supposed to fight a guy to defend his title. That did not happen. So then it was rescheduled. This is Top Rank. It got rescheduled, and now it's Callum Johnson. I've seen a pattern with pretty much every single fighter except one where they caught COVID and their performance was way lesser after they had caught COVID and they tried to get back into it. And we know that COVID causes some damage to your lungs and your breathing capacity. So this Joe Smith, Callum Johnson, if I were to call it prior to the COVID, I would say that Joe Smith should easily outbox Callum Johnson over 12. But because of the COVID, you might see somewhat of an upset here on Callum Johnson. Callum Johnson's not a bad fighter at all. I want to be clear. I just think that he is one of those that's, he's one of those guys you don't expect to win until he does, if that makes any sense. He's a solid fighter. He's a fan-friendly fighter, certainly. And with this one, he has a chance, I think, to upset Joe Smith, which, depending on what it is, could happen. That would be interesting if we see that happen. So let's see what goes on with that one. I'm let's say cautiously interested in what goes on there. If you were watching previous events, I covered the Parker versus Chisora fight, and I gave significant criticism to Parker because he's not a finisher. Many people said that Chisora just got destroyed and he should retire. He came out and basically said some colorful things to tell people he's not going to retire. He's going to keep going, just like Mayorga. And I celebrate that because if he's able to take guys like Parker the distance, that's more an indictment on Parker than it is on Chisora, because Chisora's just here to fight. He's here to stay, and he dropped him in the first round. And until we get to a point that somebody can stop him from dropping them, I think he should stay in the business and help us, get more quality fights than we've had. So then in the third week of January, we got Mr. Gary Russell Jr. versus Masayo, which I mentioned before. That's on Showtime. And that's featherweight, of course. And we got to see where Russell is. I'm leaning towards Masayo just because I don't know where Russell's head is, and if he's out in the business, out of the business, whatnot, I'm not sure. Russell has been trying to get a fight with Tank Davis, and of course Tank Davis has not fought at featherweight in a while, but he wants the money. He also wants the payday and probably a cash out on it. And Russell claims he's not doing a Floyd; he's doing his own thing. He likes what he likes, but he's just doing it his own way, and that's cool. There's talks about Leo Santa Cruz potentially fighting Gary Russell Jr. back down at 126. I think that'd be a mistake because I think Leo Santa Cruz is done in the business. He's a warrior, but I think he's done from an age perspective. And then I don't think Gary Russell has any chance to beat Tank Davis. I think Tank completely destroys him. That's why I'm thinking that Masayo possibly has a chance to upset this dude, because Russell seems distracted. He seems to be pulled in multiple directions, and he doesn't seem committed to the business. It's like he just goes in there to fight and doesn't really have the heart like a champion, I guess. Then there were some other things being talked about potentially where, Ryan Garcia might have been in the mix. I don't think that'll happen. And other ones, there's a lot going on around Mr. Gary Russell Jr. I just think the distractions we might see an upset with Masayo just pulling it out because Russell is being pulled. People see is on the way out. And they're trying to take advantage of it. Last week of January, there are two big events, one at middleweight, one at cruiserweight. One at cruiserweight was not supposed to happen, but then a mandatory apparently got in the way. But first, on the middleweight, you got Eubank Jr. versus Liam Williams. Everybody knows that Eubank Jr. is one of those fighters that looks great on the pads, and he is a name, and he has star power, and he has probably the best entrance in all of boxing at this point. But when he gets in there, he seems to just taper off. However, he's one that seems to, as he's changed trainers, he got with Roy Jones, he seems to have stepped up his desire to try to get guys out of there, which was the reason I argue he got washed by George Groves. He didn't have the same urgency, and Groves was able to exploit that, as he had later in the fight when Groves hurt his shoulder because Eubank stepped on the gas. He should have stepped on the gas in round one, and he arguably should have won that fight because Groves was well past the sell date. So now his get-backs have come through, and he's lost his opportunity against Saunders. He could still fight Saunders because Saunders is on the decline now. But this one against Liam Williams is a significant get back. That's on Sky Sports. It's happening at the Motor Point Arena in Cardiff if you're overseas. And again, I'm a fan of his dad by far and away, but I've never been impressed with Junior at all. And the funny narrative about this fight, Liam Williams basically said, he had to come out of his home turf and come to my home turf in Cardiff because he doesn't sell. He does sell, but it's just funny that he has to go to Liam's hometown. And so now it's going to be a test because he's going to be outside of his home element. And that means he has to work 10 times harder than he normally would to convince the judges that he's truly better than this dude. Liam Williams doesn't think that he's improved under Roy Jones. He's improved under Roy Jones, but Roy Jones has also been instilling upon him the preservation aspect, which not every person likes. You don't want to see guys that are excessively preserving themselves like a Frank Sanchez. What I'm ultimately saying, folks, Chris Eubank has to go out there and have basically a perfect showing because he's going to have judges that are against him. He's got to get this guy out of there, and if he doesn't, it's just going to hurt his ability to get a title shot in the future. He's been talking about Golovkin. Now that Golovkin's pretty much on the way out, he's not going to get Golovkin if he fails this test. So then in cruiserweight action, you got Ilunga Makubu, and this was the guy that Canelo was supposed to fight. There was a condition placed on this fight. This is in Ohio. He's fighting Tiabasso Machunu. This fight, Makabu was required to take the fight, and there was a condition in place. Canelo will fight Makabu, assuming Makabu wins this. So I suspect Machunu is going to pull it out, and it's going to disrupt Canelo's plans. That's my theory. Don't tell me why I think that. I just think that if that happens, then Canelo's got to find another dance partner, and I suspect that would be Benavidez. This is my prediction. I might be way off, but something tells me Makabu's not going to win it. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. In February, we've got another stacked, as far as what we know, stacked arsenal. This is where the Keith Thurman versus Mario Barros fights happen. That's in the first week of February on Fox Sports. I'd be shocked if that was not a pay-per-view because it's happening at the Mandalay Bay in Vegas. Jose Ramirez versus Jose Pedraza, two very exciting fighters at junior welterweight. That's in ESPN, so that's Top Rank. That's happening out in Fresno at the Save Mart Center. Same week, same day as Keith Mario. So if you're one of those guys that likes to go to fights in person, if you want to be excited, I would say go to the Ramirez-Pedraza fight. If you want to see the future of the division, the welterweight, I would go to Thurman Barrios. That's kind of my thought if you like to go first person. Otherwise, I would just simulcast the two because both fights I think are going to be worth your time. Since one of them is going to be in Vegas, that means it's probably going to be around 10 p.m., 9 p.m., 8 p.m., somewhere around there before you see the main event. And then the top ranked ones are usually like 6, 7, 8 p.m. Pacific time, those. And then in the middle, the big fight that everybody's been waiting for like freaking 10 years, 9, 10 years. Amir Khan versus Kell Brook for Naseem Hamed's love, way past the sell date, but that's happening February 19th is scheduled, Sky Sports at the Manchester Arena. And that's, of course, welterweight, but it's at a catch weight, so I think it's a 149-pound catch weight because Kell Brook can't make 147 anymore like Khan can. Now, the narrative of this fight is that these guys have had a beef going back from their sparring days, and they've been featured multiple times talking about beating each other, but also Naseem Hamed has spoken out, talking about he wants to find the next him, and he pegged these two potentially as being that next guy. And if you look at the two of their styles, the two of them, Kell Brook, Nassim Hamed, there was no comparison between Kell Brook and Nassim Hamed. There was a comparison between Nassim and Amir Khan, at least in terms of speed, but not in terms of style. So there was really no connection. Then Nassim, of course, disappeared, got fat and disappeared from the business. But for whatever reason, they were still interested in seeing these two fight, if only as their last curtain call, because, Khan got sparked out by Canelo. He saw his spirit leave his body for a moment, and then Kell Brook got his face smashed in by Gennady Golovkin, even though I had Brook winning that fight up until the stoppage. Then Kell Brook immediately after that goes and fights Spence at 147, is almost beating Spence, and then Spence shatters his other eye, makes him take a knee and quit, which was, I think, an amazing win. And then Kell Brook fights some other dudes, barely gets out, fights Crawford when he's on his way out the door, is Brook, and then Brook is outboxing Crawford for 4 rounds before the stoppage, which I thought was early and a little bit strange. So let's look at comparisons. Amir Khan, he knows what it's like to be knocked out. It seems to be easy to do it, but not for every fighter. It just seems like timing, and Kel's talked about this, timing is the key to getting him to be knocked out. Because remember, Maidana was not able to knock out Khan, but Canelo was. And Maidana was a very powerful fighter. He was able to do some amazing stuff in his career. He wasn't able to knock out Khan. Chris Algieri had Khan on Bambi on a couple of occasions. Chris Algieri arguably won that fight, and Chris Algieri is not known as a power puncher, but his timing is on note. So now you get Conor Benn in the mix, who wants to fight the winner of this guy. This one's a toss-up. I don't even know if it's worth calling, but if I'm my gut's speaking right, I think Kell Brook washes Amir Khan. I don't know that Kell Brook knocks him out. I think he dominates over a decision. Then you see them laughing and hugging after the fight and all this nonsense. And then Conor Benn calls out the winner, which I suspect will be Kell Brook. That's what my gut tells me. I don't think that Khan at this stage has enough to keep Kell Brook off of him, even though Kell Brook is on the decline. Kell Brook's jab is very underrated, even at this age. I don't know if it's worth your time to watch it, but if you like watching kind of the freak show type fights, maybe it's worth for that. I don't see that they're going to be trying as hard as they are selling. They're doing a good job selling it. I don't think it's going to be that amazing thing because they're just too damaged. They should have fought like 6 years ago, in my opinion. And then, of course, at the end of February, the big one for the unified in junior welterweight, this is Josh Taylor versus Jack Catterall. And this one got delayed. And Josh Taylor, I think he got sick. I don't know if it was COVID, but I think he got sick or injured or something. This is happening in Glasgow, Scotland, so this is on Taylor's home turf. It's on Sky Sports, and again, unified junior welterweight, so that's 140 pounds for supremacy there. And Josh Taylor has talked about moving to 147. He's been trying to get a fight with Terrence Crawford as well. And this one is basically a division goodbye for Taylor because, as I'm understood, he's going to vacate the unified regardless of the outcome of the fight. That means there's an open opportunity for Catterall to pull off the upset too, because if Taylor's distracted, you see these underdogs just kind of pull it out and get the win. Now, Catterall, I wouldn't say he's this amazing fighter, but he's also not a bum. I think he has a chance to beat Taylor because Taylor is one of those who, he's a warrior, right? He goes and he will get hit in order to score some hits in return. So because he has a tendency to potentially get hit in order to get a win, I think there's an opportunity here for Catterall. I'm not predicting Catterall. I'm saying there's an opportunity for him to shock the masses. However, if I look at just styles and the clash of styles between the two, Josh Taylor, for me, I don't expect him to lose just because of styles. And by this, I mean the one person who came closest to beating him was Regis Prograis. I rate Regis Prograis very highly as a fighter. And if Prograis was not able to get Taylor out of there, it tells me that somebody like Catterall is going to struggle to get even close, and I suspect it to be a unanimous decision, unless it gets like stopped on cuts or something. So that's my opinion. I think that Josh Taylor is going to win and then leave the division, vacate and leave the division. But I'm not going to dismiss Catterall's potential to pull off an upset if Taylor comes in and he is distracted for whatever reason, which is a distinct possibility. The other thing is that Josh Taylor fought Jose Ramirez ever recently, and Jose Ramirez was known as kind of this dominant fighter who had knocked out some really solid dudes, had beaten some solid fighters, has defended his title, and that's who Josh Taylor ultimately unified against, was Jose Ramirez. And I think, to my eye, and this is just me, to my eye, if we see Ramirez go in against Pedraza and pull out a dominant victory against Pedraza, which I think is a very distinct possibility because Jose Pedraza is also one of those who he's a solid fighter, but he also has been slightly declined, but he's a solid fighter regardless. If Ramirez is able to do a dominant performance against Pedraza, it might put some question marks on where Taylor is. Does that make sense? Like, if we see Josh Taylor was able to beat and unify against Ramirez, right, and then Ramirez fights Pedraza, but Ramirez dominates Pedraza, who's still decently solid, it might mean that we can see inklings that Taylor might have been on the decline a little bit after having fought Ramirez, like the fight where Ramirez might have taken something out of him. That's what I'm ultimately getting at. So I think all the fights in February, arguably, at some level or degree, are worth your time to watch. Of course, the level of degree is up to you and what's important to you. But I think all of them have their own things that they bring to the table in terms of the clashes of styles that we're going to see. And it'll be exciting to see how different fighters behave after previous fighters, to see what's going to come up from fighters that have fought before and now they've moved on or they're moving up. And as Josh Taylor starts to vacate from his unified status, as we expect, what's going to happen with George CM Punk Kambosos now that he's essentially going to be unified? What happens there with lightweight? What happens when we get to eventually Spence and Ugas? And then what happens when we get to unified of 147? There's a lot happening. And that's why I say 2022, I think, will be a hot year for boxing. If you're one of those heavyweight fans, you're probably a little bit disappointed. The rematch for Joshua versus Usyk was supposed to happen and has not been scheduled yet, but apparently Joshua did activate his right to a rematch, and Joshua has talked about his intent to come a little bit more aggressive than he had done because he's been tentative as of recent. So if that one happens, that's an exciting fight just because we think Usyk outboxes him again in easy fashion, but you never can count Joshua out in that knockout power. Then we also have Wilder, who's trying to make a comeback. I say he should fight Big Baby Miller and just knock him spark out because that fight sells itself. You got two boisterous personalities, and Miller deserves some punishment. But then Dillian White's in the mix for the mandatory. Fury doesn't really want to fight Dillian White for his WBC, and Fury's kind of taking a little bit off and may vacate the WBC, which then opens up Wilder to go back to being WBC champion again. So heavyweight will come back in the mix, but none of that's been scheduled yet. It's just all been talk. The only heavyweight fights that are in the mix right now is, of course, Luis Ortiz, who lost to Wilder, and versus Charles Martin, who lost to Joshua. That's all that's on the deck as of right now that we know of. So if you're a heavyweight fan, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed in the first quarter of 2022. It's still possible that in March something does get booked, but as it stands right now, I'm not seeing very much on the heavyweight side. The last thing I'll wrap up with is, of course, Superfly. And if you don't know Superfly is basically the guys at Super Flyweight have been the warriors that have helped keep boxing exciting. They're the ones that go out there and they really put on show every single time, even though they don't get paid anywhere near like the big guys do. So there's rumors about Estrada versus Chocolatito having a rematch. This will be the rubber match, the trilogy fight for those two guys. And I don't know where Rung Vijay is. I would love to see him come back in the mix. I don't know where Quadras is. I'd love to see him come back in the mix. And I suspect that now that we're kind of coming out the backside of the pandemic and we're kind of opening up ever slowly and we're realizing that Omicron's not as bad, that we start seeing a lot of these fights get scheduled that were deferred because a lot of these guys didn't fight in 2021 rather. So hopefully we'll start seeing, if you're a heavyweight fan, we'll start seeing more of those guys. But the heavyweight division has had some challenges with heavyweight guys, up-and-coming heavyweight guys. Many of the guys coming in are like middleweight, super middleweight, and that kind of stuff. So that's what I got as far as the boxing. There's a lot. It's not what you would expect, but there are a lot of, I think, worthwhile fights happening. It's just going to take some time for them to kind of sort out schedules. And I think the one that stands out the most to me is going to be junior welterweight. Junior welterweight, and then lightweight, super lightweight, all these, I think that mix, that's where you're going to see a lot of the biggest fights happen in the first half of the year. I think heavyweight stuff's going to happen. It's going to happen probably at the tail end of the year, possibly, when you have light heavyweights that start moving up, or you start having super middleweights that start moving up, cruiserweights that move up. I think there'll be some mixes. But for right now, that's what we got. If you have anything, make sure you like or subscribe down below. I'm not going to put the flashy things. You know where to find them, but make sure you like and subscribe. Certainly subscribe, share if you think it's of value and interest. If you're curious about our other podcasts, because we have other podcasts, we are completely on right now, cryptotalkradio.net. That's the site, cryptotalkradio.net. Although it says crypto in it, there are 3 podcasts, distinct podcasts. One of them is this one, which talks boxing. The other 2, one is on cryptocurrency specifically. One is about life, the universe, and everything. We also have the categories here on YouTube, but YouTube predominantly is where the boxing is. But if you're interested in cryptocurrency, go to cryptotalkradio.net. That takes you to a list of all of our different podcast services, and you can listen in on that one as well. And those are not on YouTube. So if you're on like a podcast application or an iTunes or something, you can subscribe to those and listen to that. That's cryptotalkradio.net is our site for getting to all of our podcasts in our network. We appreciate you, and hopefully you enjoy boxing. There will not be another update on this one, of course, until next year at this point. So hint, hint, next year, that's when you'll hear from us again. Take care.